Support for this episode is provided by Burns-O-Matic. Find your fire at burns-o-matic.com. If you'd like to build this bench, you can find these free plans on my website. There'll be a link in the description. Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in. This week I'm building a shaker style bench. It's going to be kind of a rustic project, and I'm going to build it with boards that have been hanging around the shop, and everybody has them for one reason or another. You have boards that you just don't use. This is a piece of white oak, and probably the reason I haven't used this board is there's a big check running down the center of the board. This is just an old 2x4. This is red oak. This is the cutout for the kitchen sink, the outdoor sink. And I had a few boards of red oak in the shop, so I joined these two together yesterday, and these will make up the legs of the bench. And then for the seat of the bench, I'm using this old piece of hickory, and I think I've had this in the shop for about 20 years. I'm not a huge fan of hickory, but also you can see that the board is cracked here, and it's just not the best looking board, but it's going to work good for the seat. So I'll get started today by cutting this board in half and then joining the boards together. I'm going to get started by cutting this end off of the board, and then I'll cut the board in half. Next, I'll run the boards through the joiner, giving me a nice straight edge, and then I'll rip the boards to width on the table saw. I'm using biscuits to join the boards, and I like to use a biscuit about every 10 to 12 inches, and I keep the biscuits at least 6 inches away from the ends of the boards. Now I'll move on to the legs of the bench, which are made of red oak, and I'll get started by cutting them to size. The legs will be attached to the bench seat with a through mortise and tenon. Here I measure and mark to cut the tenons. I've set up a stop block on my crosscut sled so the tenons will be exactly the same on both bench legs. I'm cutting the tenons by removing one saw blade with each pass. I'm not using a dado blade simply because I don't have one tall enough to make a cut at this depth, and the bench legs didn't take very long to cut using this method anyway. I think each leg took about 5 minutes. After cutting the tenons, I raised the blade and cut a lap joint in the center of each leg. After letting the glue set up on the bench seat for just a little more than 2 hours, I was ready to cut it to size on the table saw. First ripping the top to width, and then using my crosscut sled to crosscut the top to length. The next step is to cut the lap joint and the cross brace. I made a few test cuts off camera to make sure I was cutting the joint at the right depth and width. The cross brace at the bottom of the bench that also acts as a shelf will be attached to the bench legs using a through mortise and tenon joint. First, I'll cut the mortise using a straight edge and a 1/2 inch straight bit in the plunge router. When I make this cut, I only remove about 1/8 of an inch of material with each pass. Then I plunge down another 1/8 of an inch and remove more material. After cutting the mortise with the router, I'll square off the edges with a sharp chisel. To cut the tenon, I'm using a straight edge, and I'll use a piece of scrap wood and hold the piece of scrap wood flush with the edge of the board and clamp the straight edge in place. I'll do this on both sides so the tenon is the same depth on both the top and bottom of the board. Again, I've made a few test cuts off camera to make sure I was making the tenon at the correct thickness. Now I can dry fit the bench together, flip it upside down on the bench top, and mark lines to cut the mortises. Again, I'm going to use a straight edge and a 1/2 inch straight bit in the router to cut the mortises. This time I'll cut half the mortise, and then I'll have to adjust the fence by 1/4 of an inch to finish cutting the 3/4 inch mortise. For the half circle at the bottom of the bench, I traced a paint can on a piece of 1/2 inch MDF, then cut the shape out on the bandsaw and sanded it smooth. This will be my pattern for both legs. Next, I'll trace the pattern on both legs, cut that out on the bandsaw, leaving the line in about 1/16 of an inch. Then I'll use a flush cut bit in the router along with the pattern, and I'll have the exact shape along with a perfect cut on both legs. Before the glue up, I'm using a hand plane to soften all the hard edges. You can see I'm not going for perfection here because this bench is going to have a rustic look. I'm going to glue the base of the bench first and let the glue set up overnight. Before attaching the seat, I'll use a sanding block to add a slight chamfer on the ends of the mortises, and I'll use a hand plane to shape the bottom of the seat. I didn't have a perfect fit on all the mortise and tenon joints, so I used wedges made of red oak to fill the gaps. After the glue set up, I used a dovetail saw to cut the wedges flush with the top of the tenons. I'm going for a rustic look on this project, and I'm going to paint the bench with 3 coats of paint. The first coat is kind of a gray-green. I'll allow that to dry, and then I'll give it a light sanding, and then I'll paint the bench with a lighter green. I'll allow that to dry, give it a light sanding, and then the third coat, which I didn't get on camera, will be the same gray-green as the first coat. Once the paint dried, I brought the bench outside and sanded through the paint around the edges revealing the two different colors of green and the bare wood. Next, I'll use a blowtorch to darken the wood. This is the TS8000 by Burns-O-Matic. The trigger start makes this torch very easy to use, and it's a great tool to have around the house or shop. After darkening the wood with the torch, I gave the bench a good sanding with 150 grit sandpaper. Okay, finally I'm ready for a finish. I'm using Finisher's Choice lacquer by Mohawk Finishing Products. I'll spray 3 coats, sanding in between each coat with 220 sandpaper. Okay, well, a little different from a lot of things that I've made on this channel, but I like it, and my wife likes it, and her friends like it, so maybe I'll make more things like this. We'll see. When I first started woodworking, this rustic style was very popular. This was back in the late 80s, and things like this is what we made a lot of. I did make a few changes during the build of this project, and I wanted to talk about those. The seat brace at the bottom here, I originally was planning to make that out of Douglas fir, but it just so happened I had enough cutoff from the hickory top, so I used that. And the other big change was I had planned on painting the seat and having the seat mostly green, the color of the bench. But then as I started to work on it, I thought, well, I think the seat will look nice if it's more natural. So that's why I sanded almost all of the paint off of the top of the seat here. If I were to do that again, or do this again, I might just put a little paint around the tenons, because I do like the way the paint collects around the tenons. So that's something to keep in mind. If you don't like this kind of finish, you can build the bench and just give it a clear coat. You can build this out of cherry or walnut or pine. It's really up to you. A big thank you to Burns-O-Matic for supporting my channel and this project. And if you like this video, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and comment. And if you're subscribed to my channel, I hope you'll hit that little bell. That will notify you each time I post a new video. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.